Sri Lanka, a country that has become synonymous with economic disasters. The situation has got to a point where children are out of schools and parents are losing their jobs. But this sparks a big question. Is there any other country that might go the Sri Lankan way? Well, with the international markets slumping, global food crisis at play, and a war in Ukraine raging, many economies are being pushed to the edge. Alarm bells are ringing from Caracas to Islamabad. Now, according to a new report, some 1.6 billion people in 94 countries face at least one dimension of the crises, be it food, energy, or financial. And about 1.2 billion people are living in severely vulnerable economies. Every major global intervention has a ripple effect. Like the coronavirus pandemic affected every country's tourism sector. The food crisis created by the war in Ukraine led to a rise in prices at your local departmental stores. Just like that, a slumping international market will affect your cost of living. Some of the worst hit countries are those that are already devastated by corruption, civil war, coups, and other calamities. So let's look at 7 such economies that are hanging by a thread, starting with Afghanistan, a country ravaged by decades of invasions and coups. And since Taliban took charge in 2021 August, not only is the economy in shambles, there is no clarity on how bad the situation is. The Taliban regime took over Kabul and soon came the information blackout. But what we know is that the only thing keeping the Afghan economy afloat has stopped. We are talking about foreign aid. Since the troop pullout, Western countries seized existing banks and paralyzed trade. And on top of that, it also levied crippling sanctions. So about half the country's 39 million people face life-threatening issues. Like Sri Lanka, Pakistan has also been keeping the IMF busy. Islamabad is hoping to revive a $6 billion bailout package. Soaring crude oil prices pushed up fuel prices. This further rose inflation to over 21%. To gain the IMF's support, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has also imposed a new 10% super tax on major industries. As of late March, Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves had fallen to $13.5 billion. This is equivalent to just 2 months of imports. Let's look at Argentina now, where about 4 out of every 10 people are poor. And at a time like this, its currency has weakened. So the central bank is running alarmingly low on foreign reserves. Inflation is forecast to exceed 70% this year. Talks over a deal with the IMF to restructure its debt is ongoing, but that is not expected to go smoothly. Egypt's inflation rate surged to almost 15% in April. This caused a dire situation for the people living in poverty, who are heavily dependent on state welfare programs. This is on top of some last resort measures that the country has taken, like floating the national currency and slashing subsidies for fuel, water, and electricity. The central bank raised interest rates to curb inflation, but in the short term, this means more misery for the people of Egypt. Lebanon and Sri Lanka are more alike than you would think. Both have a toxic combination of currency collapse, shortages, high inflation, and a decimated middle class. Each too has endured a long civil war, and its recovery has been hampered by a greedy government. The currency began to sink, and that is when Lebanon defaulted on paying back its debt. It was estimated to be $90 billion at the time, which is 170% of Lebanon's GDP, one of the highest in the world. Now let's talk about Myanmar. The political instability has put the country's economy in shambles, especially after the army seized power in February 2021. The takeover brought Western sanctions targeting commercial holdings controlled by the army. The economy contracted by 18% last year, and it is forecast to barely grow in 2022. And lastly, Turkey. Worsening government finances and a growing trade deficit can only bring trouble. Within weeks, high inflation and debt followed. The central bank resorted to using foreign reserves to fend off a currency crisis. The lira fell to an all-time low against the US dollar. Families are struggling to buy food and other goods. Meanwhile, Turkey's foreign debt is about 54% of its GDP. These are a lot of facts and figures, but to avoid a situation like Sri Lanka, these governments need to take urgent and brutal steps, because a crisis like Sri Lanka's cannot be solved with one line of credit or an IMF loan. It needs years of recovery while the commoners face the brunt.